Hi, everyone. I hope you enjoyed last week's interview with President Seth Bodnar. Hopefully you gained some insights and connected some things that he talked about to some of the concepts that we've covered throughout the semester. Um, One of the really interesting things before we started that interview, we were chatting and the president asked me if I had ever read Rummelt's Good Strategy, Bad Strategy, and I mentioned that we were using that for the class, that was our primary book, and he shared his opinion that he thought that was the best book on strategy he's ever read, and so that was encouraging to hear that. This week we are reading a piece from Jim Collins called "Good to Great and the Social Sectors," and as you've probably picked up on, that is a kind of an addendum to a book he wrote titled simply "Good to Great." And last week I had you read an article by Jim Collins that really covered a lot of the concepts, but it didn't go into a lot of detail about those concepts. Um, Hopefully, at some point, if you haven't read Good to Great, you do that. But what I thought I would do today is spend a little bit of time talking about some of the concepts. Just some of them may be a little bit ambiguous or unclear, and so I thought some clarity in that regard would be helpful. Perhaps again tie them to some of the things that we're doing in the class. Um, One of the things I also did is that I shared links to some very short videos of Jim Collins speaking about these various concepts. I put those on the Moodle site, and so I encourage you to watch those and explore his entire website, the Jim Collins website, if you're interested in getting a little bit more in depth about some of his ideas about leadership, organizational thinking, and organizational action. Um, so one of the things that he talks about in terms of the differences between private sector, the business sector, and the government and nonprofit sector is, he talks about greatness being, not necessarily a matter of, greatness happens in the business sector, but not in the social sectors. He wants us to focus on the fact that you can be great in both sectors, you can be mediocre in both sectors. And one of the challenges in the public and nonprofit realm is how do you define greatness? In business, it's typically fairly easy. You look at money, you look at profit. Social sector, he talks about money being really only an input. It's not a measure of the outcomes of the organization. And so he offers up this definition of a great organization that clearly fits no matter if you're a business or whether you are a nonprofit or a educational institution, government institution, or whatever. A great organization is one that delivers superior performance and makes a distinctive impact over a long period of time. So he talks about, the critical question is how effectively do we deliver on our mission and make a distinct impact relative to the resources that we have available to us. So one of the things he talks about that's really critical is in building a great organization and maintaining a great organization is that you do need to measure and be accountable to your outputs. And so, he says even if those outputs defy measurement, what matters is that you rigorously assemble evidence, whether that's quantitative data, qualitative evidence, and you track your progress. So think about that as you are working towards the end of this semester on your projects. One of the last things you will do is start to build a plan of action for your organization. So think about how those measurements, those outcomes will come into play, and how you can assemble the evidence that shows that your organization will be making progress over time. So the first one of so he talks initially about some of the concepts that are related to discipline around people in an organization, and he talks about level 5 leadership. Um, and, and building a great organization, and he talks about level 5 leadership. 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 And he talks about level 5 leader So basically, the definition of a level 5 leader is they are ambitious first and foremost for the cause, the movement, the mission, the work, and not themselves. So it's a matter of really being outward focused, being focused on the service of the organization as opposed to their own gain. And level 5 leaders also have one distinction, is that they make sure that the right decisions happen no matter how difficult or painful those decisions are. So one of the things I think is the case is that, it's certainly public and nonprofit organizations are ripe for level 5 leaders simply because they are very much oriented towards mission, towards a service orientation. One of the discussions in the reading this week that I thought was really interesting, and something that I experience on a regular basis at a university, a large complex organization, is the concept of executive versus legislative leadership. And so he talks about, in some cases, leaders have the ability to make decisions more or less unilaterally, to have impact based on the power of their position in an organization. But in some cases, and particularly in larger complex organizations, a leader may not have the ability to make those sort of executive decisions, and they might have to rely more on the legislative sort of power. And so that includes relying on persuasive abilities, relying on political currency, relying on shared interests within the larger organization. Really, it's leadership that's built on creating and maintaining strong relationships. And so you need to do those things in order for decisions to get made across the organization, as opposed to them coming down strictly from a top-level executive. And I mentioned I experienced this at the university, especially in working in information technology. We have a central IT organization. That is where the university's chief information officer resides. They have some executive authority over people who work within the central IT organization. But there are also these distributed IT organizations across the organization that have been built by academic units, administrative units. It really requires a great deal of relationship building and trust building by the CIO in order for consistent decisions, coherent action to happen. And to be honest, that just has not happened over the last the years that I've been part of IT. It's a very difficult leadership skill to develop. It's difficult, I think, to find people who have that level of leadership skill. And in fact, even I think difficult maybe to find leaders who understand that that's what is necessary to make decisions in an organization. And so that may not happen as much in a smaller nonprofit organization, for example. But I think if you do find yourself in educational institutions or larger government organizations in leadership roles, think about that exercising of leadership really as a relationship building exercise, getting people to follow you because of the good ideas that you have, because of the trust that you've built, as opposed to simply following an executive order based on your positional authority. Another people-related concept that Jim Collins talks about is thinking about, first, before you think about where your organization needs to go or what the organization needs to do, think about who is on the bus. This is basically what he says: getting the right people on the bus, the wrong people off the bus, and the right people in the right seats. And so I was really interested last week in talking to President Bodner about this concept. He's now been at the university for 10 months, and certainly my observation of his actions has been this has been his mode of operation, that he came in really understanding that he needed to get the right people in leadership positions. And so he has hired a couple of new vice presidents. He has maybe not let people go, but some people have left leadership positions, clearly seeing that maybe they weren't in the organization's future. President Bodnar also talked about some restructuring that he had done. He's restructured our student affairs division and put them closer to academic affairs, so that student success in the administrative side is closely tied to a student success in the classroom and on the academic side. And the big thing he's done is he basically created a new sector of enrollment and communication, putting our recruitment and our marketing efforts together. And he explained in that interview that he just didn't see how it worked previously, where those two things were not connected together in the organizational structure and the challenges he saw with that. So. Another real critical concept that Jim Collins talks about, he refers to it as the hedgehog concept, and this might be a little bit more difficult to grasp the meaning of, but really what the hedgehog concept is about is leading with clarity and focus. It's about understanding what the core of the organization does and why it does it, and so it's really, great organizations tend to have the discipline to stick to their core and to say no to things that maybe don't fit within the values and the strengths of the organization. And so, I know a lot of you have done SWOT analyses for your organizations. And so if you've come to understand what your organization feels like it's really good at and maybe what it's not so good at, those are things that come into play in your strategy is, really focusing on building on those strengths and maybe getting away from the things that aren't as important or aren't as much of a strength of the organization. So the hedgehog concept really is about these three circles coming together. So, the first one is about passion. What is your organization deeply passionate about? And typically good organizations in government and nonprofit in particular have a very strong and clear mission statement. They know what they are about, and so sticking to that, understanding what your values are, sticking to those values. It's about what you can be best at. Jim Collins uses the term, what can you be best at in the world? And I guess one of the things I would say about that is, think of the world as the world you live in. Maybe not the entire world, but in some cases, your organization needs to be the best, at least in your community or in your county or in your state or in your region or whatever that might be. You can define what the world is for you, but it should be something that you do maybe better than anybody else or have the opportunity to do better than anyone else in that area that you operate in. And then the third circle that intersects with these is, in the business sector, it's what drives your economic engine. He amends that a little bit in the social sectors by replacing economic with your what drives your resources engine. And so, he talks about the number one resource in great social sector organizations is having enough of the right people willing to commit themselves to the mission. And so that includes not just the employees, but board members, volunteers, funders, other stakeholders who are engaged in the mission of your organization. And I think one of the things that's interesting about the public sector, nonprofit sector is that resource acquisition can be have a wide variety of skill sets associated with it. I spent about 15 years on the board of directors of a local nonprofit called Child Care Resources. And when I first joined the board, a vast majority of the funding for this organization came from government. It was through grants, typically federal grants that came through the state and then filtered down to organizations like Child Care Resources to to use for benefiting families and child care providers. And so what I saw happen over the years that I was part of this board was that as government funding decreased, the organization had to maintain its level of service and to maintain, being a highly effective organization, had to diversify its resources. And so it did that in a couple of ways. One was it found ways to basically become a business. So, for example, they created an online child care provider training a series of courses, and started very small locally, but then started marketing it to some local or to regionally across other states, working with statewide organizations. Eventually, the state of Montana contracted with Child Care Resources to provide online training for all of the providers in the state. And so that offered us some nice diversified, it took a while even for that, I guess, that business within the nonprofit to pay for itself. But over time of continually building on it, it not only paid for itself, but it also filled in some of that gap in funding that was lost from government funding. And then the third thing that the organization had to do that was also painful and took some time, but it had to basically adjust from having a board that was focused on sort of the operation of the organization to a board that was focused on fundraising and bringing in, outside dollars. And that was it was a painful process, but over time you identified that as a goal. With each board opening, we would think about who could contribute to the skill sets and the networking and the connections that could improve the organization's fundraising capabilities. And so 3 very different sort of skill sets or areas of acumen that some nonprofit and government organizations might have to look at. Another concept that Collins talks about is this concept of turning the flywheel. If you haven't heard of this, flywheel, the flywheel concept is really about this idea that change happens with consistent cumulative effort over a long period of time. The idea being that big things happen when you do a lot of little things really well, and that compounds over time. And basically, the way that happens is that you build these internal habits that give you a little bit of success. That success, people are energized by that, both inside the organization and outside stakeholders. That builds momentum, and over time, like I said, you use that flywheel effect to get better and better. I know there's an organization that I'm aware of that's an IT organization across all of higher education that uses this concept very literally. Actually, they have people within their organization that they actually call the flywheels, and it's their jobs to make sure that this momentum happens by, making sure that the communication across groups is happening clearly, making sure the projects are moving forward on time and those types of things. And so think about how you can build that sort of a concept into your strategies as well with your organizations. And then the last concept that I wanted to touch on that Collins talks about is this concept of confronting the brutal facts. And so, in the first stage of your strategy projects with your organizations, your task was to go out and to try to understand the organization, to uncover facts about what was going on, to diagnose what was happening within the organization. And, I saw some of you that did a really nice job of not only developing those facts, but actually doing exactly what Collins talks about, confronting the brutal facts, that there are some really big obstacles, some really big barriers that your organizations would have to overcome in order to be successful. And so Collins talks about the Stockdale paradox, which is this idea that really successful, really great organizations maintain kind of these contradictory things within their organization and within their leadership. The one, that they retain the faith that the organization will prevail in the end, regardless of the constraints and the difficulties that it's facing. But at the same time, they're willing to confront those brutal facts and the reality of what's happening and how they'll have to go about addressing those. And so, a couple comments about that. I talked earlier a lot about, we talked about strategic processes, whether you were going to use an adaptive process, design thinking process, kind of a traditional process in your strategic planning. I talked about creative processes. I guess I would go back to that idea in this first part about retaining faith as those processes are really about trusting the process. Often when you're doing them, you don't really know what the outcome's going to be. No one that you're working with necessarily knows that you're going to be successful. But if you trust the process, follow it through from beginning to end, with good, strong conviction and discipline, typically you will come out with positive results on the other side. And then one thing that was interesting to me from last week in reading through the discussion forums, many of you talked about some big systemic constraints that your organizations were facing. By that I'm talking about, you would talk about things like, well, we have these too many rules and regulations to overcome, or there's just not enough funding to do this, or other resource constraints, whether that's people or time or whatever. And Collins talks about that's something that people often obsess about, is focusing on these systemic constraints that just seem too big to overcome. So really what he talks about is, thinking about what you can do today in your organization to create what he calls pockets of greatness. And it says you can build pockets of greatness in the middle of an organization without any sort of executive power. I had a really interesting experience 2 or 3 years ago here at the university, where I had worked with a couple of colleagues on a project to try to improve internal communication across the university. And we talked, I think I've mentioned this story before, where we talked to well over 100 people. We developed some recommendations, some strategies based on what we had learned. We went to the cabinet, we presented our strategies, and we made the classic mistake of thinking, well, we had done our job. We had come up with solutions. We'd handed them over to campus leadership and expected that those things, those leaders would actually make the change happen. That almost never happens. And I think it didn't take us too long to realize that really the way things were going to happen was, again, sort of taking this approach that we could do some great things at the grassroots level, lead by example, maybe build some momentum through that flywheel effect. So one of the strategies that we thought about was how do we get a lot of people on board with this? And we decided we would create a book club where we would focus on sort of this, leading without any sort of executive power, leading from anywhere you were within the organization. And we were very fortunate to have picked a book that really kind of sparked a lot of emotional energy on campus. And it was a book called Rebels at Work, a handbook for leading change from within. And so we chose this book. Each of us reached out to our network of colleagues across campus and said, hey, we're thinking about doing this book club. We're thinking about starting with this Rebels at Work book. Would you be interested? Almost every single person said they were interested. Even a few who said, well, I don't read, but I'd like to be part of the book club. And I think it was really because of the sense that people, needed to feel like they had some control, some agency, some ability to make change happen within their organization. One of the interesting things that happened was, we started this and word kind of spread. And actually the dean of the College of Education, Bobby Evans at the time, thought this was a wonderful idea. She actually bought a copy of the book for every member of her faculty, invited me to a lunchtime meeting, a faculty meeting, where we had some conversations about how we could lead, how we could create change within the organization. And I think one of the important things, I don't want to go through all of the kind of pieces of advice from rebels at work, but one of the really important things was this distinction that, just being a rebel isn't enough. There is such thing as being a bad rebel and a good rebel, an ineffective rebel, an effective leadership rebel. And the bad rebels, I've talked earlier in the semester about, engagement as an issue. And the bad rebels are the ones who are actively disengaged, who are trying to hurt your organization. The good rebels really, I think the distinction is that they exhibit sort of a lot of these attitudes and behaviors that Collins talks about in his concepts. So, for example, a good rebel is mission focused as opposed to me focused. That very much fits into that level 5 leadership orientation of a leader. Good rebels generate energy as opposed to sapping energy. I think that fits into that flywheel concept of you are one of the people who continually pushes the organization forward in a positive way. And then, there's a few of these that good rebels ask questions. They pinpoint causes. They're optimistic people. And so I think those sort of fit into that Stockdale paradox, where you're willing to question what's going on, but you also stay optimistic about the fact that you can have a positive effect on that. And so think about, many of you in the organizations that you work in now, or organizations that you will move into in your career, you will likely be in leadership areas where you don't have executive leadership authority. Think about how you can use some of these concepts to be a leader in small pockets. Think about with your projects, how you can build some of this, good to great concepts into your strategies. I think, kind of just as a summary, really that what Collins is talking about is good to great. Moving an organization from good to great requires discipline. It requires disciplined people, disciplined thought, disciplined action. So that disciplined, the people is the leadership, and the right people in the right places, the right structure. Disciplined thought, again, is about being willing to confront the brutal facts, being willing to be very disciplined about what your core is, and sticking to that, not necessarily just chasing resources to chase resources. And then disciplined action is that culture of doing the little things well every day. He talks about preserving the core, which is your core values and your core strengths, your core passions, and yet being willing to stimulate progress in your organization through adaptation and experimentation. So that's it for this week. I hope you've enjoyed the readings. I hope you explored the Jim Collins videos and his website a little bit more, and we will talk to you next week. Thanks.